Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Heritage Lecture for May, the Morris Canal in Illustrated History. Thank you for joining us. My name is Allison Somersayer. I'm the Executive Director of the Delaware River Greenway Partnership. DRGP works to preserve and enhance the natural, cultural, and recreational resources of the lower Delaware River in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And our Heritage Lecture Series is generously funded by the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. Our presentation tonight explores the history of the Morris Canal from its inception in the 1820s to its abandonment 100 years later. Thank you to our speaker, Tim Roth, for sharing his expertise with us tonight. Tim is the Vice President of the Canal Society of New Jersey. He serves on the boards of Canal Watch and the Warren County Parks Foundation. The Canal Society of New Jersey is a nonprofit organization formed in 1969 to foster the study of the history of New Jersey's two towpath canals, preserve and restore canal remains and artifacts, and educate the public of the canal's histories, provide enjoyment to its members by visiting canals and other historic sites. At the end of the presentation, there'll be time for a Q&A facilitated by my colleague Cindy Kunis. Feel free to submit questions as we go along. Cindy will compile them. And if you enjoy the lecture, please donate to DRGP and let your friends and family know that they can watch a recording on our YouTube site. Now I'll hand it over to Tim.
Okay, thank you, Allison, and thank you, everyone who joined in on this rainy night. The Delaware River is actually a very important and relevant topic to the Morris Canal because the canal really owes its existence to commodities on both sides of the river, or on either side of the river. If you've been traveling around North Jersey, as I do all the time, you've probably been dealing with the closure on Route 80. We had a big collapse, what was called a sinkhole, and that sinkhole was actually caused by an old iron mine. In northern New Jersey, the mining of iron ore was very big. There are many, many iron mines all over northern New Jersey. It was the chief commodity being mined 200 years ago. Now, if you're familiar with anything at all with iron mining, we mine the iron ore and then we smelt it in a big furnace. And up to the early part of the 19th century, these large furnaces were being fired by wood. But wood, as you know, burns very quickly, and our wood resources were becoming depleted. So if we were able to go in a time machine 200 years ago, all the very thick wooded areas we have today would have been wide open fields. So there was a need to come up with a new energy source to fire these furnaces and to heat our homes and for all other purposes. So that leads to the beginning of our story, which takes place in 1822. It involves a man named George McCullough. If you've ever visited Morristown, is McCullough Hall, very wealthy businessman. And the legend has it that in 1822, he was fishing on what we now know as Lake Opakon, and he struck on the idea of using the waters of Lake Opakon as the headwaters to build a canal across northern New Jersey. Now, if we look at this 1822 quote, it kind of explains why there was a need for a canal. The mouth of the Musconetcong, which that would be the Delaware River, is close to inexhaustible mines of coal, which could be afforded in New York so cheap as to exclude not only Liverpool coal, but also wood, which grows daily dearer. And for this reason, it would be used instead of any other fuels in distilleries, manufacturers, steamboats, etc. So what he's basically saying here is we have all this anthracite coal across the Delaware River in Pennsylvania, but we need a means to transport it into New Jersey. So our choice is either build this canal, continue to use wood, which we're quickly running out of, or use Liverpool coal. Well, we all know from the Beatles that Liverpool's in England, so that means importing coal from Europe. So what he doesn't mention at all is the possibility of transporting the coal by road. And that's because transporting large cargo by road 200 years ago was so infeasible that it was actually easier and more efficient to ship it 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean than it was to truck it, just say 100 miles from Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And that seems very strange today. But that was the reason that really fueled the building of canals 200 years ago. So we're going to answer a couple questions here. And the first question we're going to answer is, where did the money come from? Who funded the Morris Canal? Mr. McCullough really wanted the state of New Jersey to fund it. He wanted to be a publicly owned entity. The state wanted nothing to do with it. So his partners formed this private entity called the Morris Canal and Banking Company. And through this entity, they were able to raise $2 million in capital, which was enough to actually fund the initial building of the canal. Today, that probably wouldn't even pay for the plans, but it was enough on 1824 to fund this canal. It also caused George McCullough to disassociate himself with the whole project. And there are two reasons for that. One, he didn't want the canal to be uh, in the hands of speculators. He wanted it to be owned by the public, not by people who were, speculating in stock. Secondly, he didn't like that it was a banking company. Like a lot of wealthy men at the time, he didn't like banks. He didn't trust banks. He didn't want his name associated with it and called it banking company. So even though George McCullough was considered the father of the Morris Canal, he was only involved for the first few years, and then he got out of it. Um, Financially, that was a smart decision. The Morris Canal Banking Company ran the canal for about 100 years. It's only a few years in the 1860s that it made a profit. So financially, it was really a failure. So the second question we're going to answer is about where the water came from. Well, I mentioned that Lake Hopatcong would be the primary source of water. And if you're familiar with Lake Hopatcong, you're probably familiar with the illustration or the picture that's over on the right-hand side of your screen. That's not the body of water that Mother Nature gave us. Mother Nature gave us what we see on the left side of the screen, two much smaller bodies of water. The lower pond was called Musconetcong Pond. It was also called Great Pond or Hopatcong Pond, and then a much smaller pond to the north called Little Pond. And so when they do, excuse me,
Tim, this is Allison, there's a few requests for you to,
okay,
there you go, you did it,
yeah,
excellent.
okay, thank you. Sorry, saw your text message come up. So, when they dammed this up, to create the Lake Hopatcong as we know it today, the level of the lake was risen 5 feet, and that was enough to connect these two bodies of water and to create many of the coves that you see there. Now, to give you some perspective, if you look on the left side of the screen, it says Brooklyn Ferry. That was actually the site of a forge. That was below the southern terminus of Musconetcong Pond. Today, that's back on the state park. It's about a mile above the southern terminus of the lake. You may also have heard that Hopatcong is a Lenni Lenape name, meaning either lake of many coves or honey water of many coves. That is incorrect. It doesn't translate that way. And most of the coves that are in Lake Hopatcong actually exist because of the Morris Canal. So they weren't around when the native people were here. So on November 4th, 1831, the first trip was made across the Morris Canal, and it went from the canal at that point stretched from the Delaware River, but only as far east as Newark. It would take another 5 years to extend the canal to Jersey City so that we connect the two rivers on either side of New Jersey, the Delaware River with the Hudson River. Why 5 years just to go from Newark to Jersey City? Well, if you look on the right-hand side of your screen where the map is, you see between Newark and Jersey City, there's a V there, and that's called a canal elbow. And the reason these exist is they were digging the canal and they were doing it by hand. If they came to bedrock, There no way to get through it, no blasting or anything like that. They would have to dig their way around it. And they didn't have any surveying equipment back then, so they didn't really know about that. So what happened is they're going east from Newark. They hit this bedrock, and they have to keep going south and south all the way to the northern border of Bayonne, then to work their way back up to Jersey City. So what did they hit? Well, if you're familiar with the upper Hudson, you probably know about the Palisades Cliffs. Southward, the Palisades actually continues underground. It's known as the Palisades Ledge. So that's what they hit. They hit the Palisades Ledge. They had to dig around it to get around it, and that's why it took another 5 years to get to Jersey City. But at that point, they connected to the two rivers, so now you could transport coal and other commodities from Pennsylvania to New York. In the bottom of the screen, you see all the towns that the canal went through, 6 counties, numerous towns across northern New Jersey that it went through. Many people live in these towns today have no idea that there was actually a navigable waterway that went through their town. So the Morris Canal became part of the New Jersey and Pennsylvania canal system. You could see the main canals on this map. On the upper left, there is the Lehigh Canal, and that transported coal from a distribution center that was called Mauchunk. Today we know Mauchunk is Jim Thorpe. It was renamed. And so coal came down from the mountains there on the gravity railroads to Mauchunk and then made its way down the Lehigh to Easton. Now at Easton, the boats had a choice. They could either go across the Delaware there to Phillipsburg and they'd make their way across northern New Jersey to Newark, Jersey City, New York City, or they could go down the Delaware division of the Pennsylvania side to New Jersey's other towpath canal, which was the Delaware and Raritan or DNR. And that went from Trenton to New Brunswick. So that would allow the coal or whatever cargo to be transported either to Trenton or to New Brunswick on the Raritan Bay. It could continue also south to Bordentown, which gave it access to the Delaware River. The other main canal in Pennsylvania was the Schuylkill, and Schuylkill mostly served Philadelphia. Now, there was a big challenge with building the Morris Canal. Mr. McCullough was not quite aware of what he'd gotten into when he conceived of this canal. Northwest section of New Jersey is called the New Jersey Highlands. And it's actually part of the Appalachian Mountain Train that runs from Georgia all the way up to Maine. And a lot of people don't know, a lot of people outside of New Jersey don't know we have this mountainous region here. I live on one of those mountains. I live on Schooley's Mountain. So if I went out of state and said, yeah, I'm from New Jersey, I live on top of an Appalachian mountain, they would kind of look at me kind of strangely. But that's true. And so to build the canal, it had to cross all these mountains. So George McCullough, when he conceived of this canal, he made a rough estimate of what the elevation change would be. And he guesstimated it would be about 300 feet. And he was way, way, way off. The actual elevation change was 1,674 feet. And we arrive at that. It's the summit at Lake Hopatcong was 914 feet to the tidewaters at the east and 760 feet to the Delaware River Valley to the west. So now they're on the hook to build this canal. They had to come up with a way to overcome these elevations. How are they going to do it? Well, the most conventional way, and the way that was used on the Morris Canal, were lift locks. And lift locks are pretty common. Most canals, the Lehigh, the DNR, they all have locks. Pretty simple. You have two walls, you have gates on both ends. You have valves that let the water in from the top to raise boats up. You have valves to let water out at the lower canal to let water out. And this allows the boats to be raised and lowered kind of like on a water elevator. So there are a total of 34 locks across the Morris Canal. 2 of these were outlet locks. So if you're traveling from Phillipsburg to Jersey City, you would encounter 32 locks you had to go through. And here we see a couple of historic photos of Morris Canal lift locks. The upper one, left one, is at Wharton, Lock 2 East, They overcame an elevation of about 9 feet. And we can see a Morris Canal boat making its way through the lock. At the end of the lock, you see the tender operating the machinery. The captain has opened a mule feed box to feed the mules. The mule driver is coming forward with the mule feed basket, and you see the mules looking back in anticipation. Then we have these two young ladies standing there. They have their picnic basket and their jug. We don't know if they're just passerbys or they're actually the daughters of the canal boat captain ready to get on the boat. Lower right, we see a Lock One East in Ledgewood, and that's actually a work scow making its way through kind of a smaller boat, but it locks through just the same. And if you're familiar with Ledgewood at all, this looks very different today. It was very rural back then. Now this is all um, highways and gas stations and strip malls. It's really developed now, but New Jersey was much more rural back then. So locks were good for overcoming elevation about 10 to 15 feet. The deepest on the Morris Canal was 17 feet. What would happen if you had to overcome an elevation of 90 feet, which was typical going across the highlands? Well, you could do this. This is called a flight of locks, and you basically stack locks up as they're like, a flight of stairs. And it works, but there's a logistical issue. If it takes you about 10 minutes to get through each lock and you have 9 locks to overcome 90 feet, do the math. That's an hour and a half to go overcome that 90 feet in elevation. You might go a few miles down the canal, then there's a 60-foot change, and that's another hour. So using flights of locks is going to add a lot of time to the trip across the state. The photo you see here, this is an actual flight of locks. It's not Photoshop. This is in the Kennet Navy Canal, England, 29 locks, 237 feet in elevation. It actually takes more than 5 hours to traverse this flight of locks. So with all the large changes in elevation going across the state of New Jersey, this was not the most efficient method to be used. So they came up with another method, and that was the use of inclined planes. And this is what really made the Morris Canal unique. It was the first canal in the world to use inclined planes and the only one in the United States. Now, if you look at the diagram in the upper right, you see the original design used a big water wheel, kind of like a water wheel you'd see in a mill, very similar. And that worked for a while, but it was only good for pulling boats that were about 20 tons fully loaded. So once we got into the 1840s and we started getting into the Industrial Revolution, the demand for coal, the demand for other commodities, iron ore, really, really greatly increased. Um, and they had to redesign the canal. So what they did is they pushed the reset button. The Morris Canal Banking Company sold more stock, and they totally redesigned the canal. They made it wider, they made the locks bigger, and they redesigned completely the design of the inclined planes. So if you look at the diagram in the middle of this slide, you see the final design of the inclined plane and what we see of the remnants today. And the way this works is there's a huge turbine, and you can see the lower left. That's a surviving one in Packard State Park. You can see how big it is. That's me. And that was buried 20 feet underground in a chamber. And the water would come from the upper canal down a flume and down a large pipe called a pen race. Yeah, a turbine. Yeah. And then it would penstock, not pen race. And then it would go underneath the turbine and turn it like a lawn sprinkler. And that enormous force of water and gravity would turn that wheel, which would turn the drum with the cables on it. And that would pull the boats up and down the inclined plane. They were pulled on a cradle that was had kind of railroad wheels, like train wheels, and there were rails laid down on the plane. So it pulled this cradle up and down with the boat in it. So basically, you floated the boat onto the cradle like you'd put a boat on a trailer. You get the water flowing through the turbine, it would start turning the cables and pull it up and down. If you visit inclined planes today, usually the only thing you'll find is what we call the sleeper stones. And those were large stones that were set in the ground, and that's what the rails were attached to. So there are 23 inclined planes across the Morris Canal. So if we do a little math, 23 inclined planes, 32 locks, 55 places where there is some amount of elevation change. So the canal was 102 miles long. That means on the average, every less than 2 miles, there was an elevation change on the Morris Canal, and change could be from 1 feet up to 100 feet. But the planes overcame anywhere between 33 and about 100 feet in elevation, and all told, they saved more than 18 hours going across the state, as opposed to using a flight of locks. So we have a couple of historic photos here. The upper one, we see a boat just float itself into the cradle, and now the cradle's starting to make its way up the plane. That's in Booton. And then the one in the lower right, that's in Wharton's plane 5 East. And this is kind of the captain's eye view, being in the cradle, looking down the plane. The boat that's here is actually not a cargo boat, it's an inspection boat. That's where you um, see the wheel there. But on the left in the lower photo, you see that structure on the left. That's actually the powerhouse. That's where all the equipment was to the big drum and the controls and so on to operate the machinery that started to flow water and got the cables moving and started um, lowering and raising the boat on the inclined planes. And that's where your plane tender would be um, stationed while the plane was in operation. So once the inclined plane was developed on the Morris Canal, it was considered an engineering marvel. And engineers came from all over the world to see how it was done. And it started being repeated around the world, Europe, Asia, and many places. Today, since the Morris Canal was abandoned, there were no operating inclined planes in the United States. There are in other parts of the world, and this is the Elblag Canal in Poland. It was built using Morris Canal technology, and it's still in operation. It's a tourist attraction. If you take a trip to Poland, you can take a boat ride up and down the inclined plane. You can see it here in operation. And the gentleman who was in charge of this canal came to the U.S. in 2019 because he wanted to see where it all started. And he made a journey across New Jersey to see all 23 sites of inclined planes. Didn't speak a word of English. The police were called many times, but fortunately, he never got arrested. And he did a program for us. He did a very nice program talking about the Elblag Canal and the operating inclined plane. We got to see a video and stuff. So if you ever want to actually ride in one, you have to take a trip to Poland. So every lock in plane had what was called a tender, and that was a person or family who lived right there and operated these planes and locks, sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week, every day except Sunday. They were not paid a lot of money, but they were provided housing. The Morris Canal Banking Company gave them a house to live in all year round. So in the lower right, you see a tender's house. That's a Brooklyn Lock at Lake Hopatcong. That was the outlet lock to Lake Hopatcong. Today, that's the Lake Hopatcong Historical Museum. Great museum if you get to visit it. In the upper left, we see a woman who's operating the upper gate or the drop gate. And they worked very simple. They brought up on chain. And then once you lowered the water in the lock, the water pressure kept them in place. Once the water came back up, and so you had equilibrium on both sides, you just needed to give the gate a little nudge with the pole, and it would drop down. So this is Lock 2 West in Mount Olive. It was actually an all-female run lock. It was known as Fluke's Lock. Mr. Fluke spent his day on a work scow, but he had a wife and 4 daughters. They were the ones who were operating the lock. So you see one of the Fluke daughters here who is operating lock, getting ready for a boat to go out to the upper canal. So I mentioned that Lake Hopatcong was the main water source for the Morris Canal. There are many secondary sources of water. There are other reservoirs that are today's lakes. Lake Musconetcong, Cranberry Lake, Greenwood Lake, Bear Pond were all built as reservoirs for the Morris Canal. The Morris Canal also followed rivers all across the state, just as the DNR did, because it constantly drew water off the rivers when the canal got low, and dumped water off the canal into the rivers when the water was really high. So there are numerous places where the canal crossed rivers. Now, how did it cross? Well, the most prevalent way was to navigate across the river, which seems pretty simple. But to navigate across most of the rivers required three things. You needed a dam to create slack water. You couldn't pull a boat across, against the current. You needed a bridge to allow the mule and the mule driver to get across. And you needed what was called a guard lock. And a guard lock was locked between the canal and another body of water, and it controlled the water going into the canal. So you didn't have just free flowing water into the canal. So in the upper photo, what you're seeing is a boat just came down an inclined plane. This is across from Waterloo Village. It's being pulled out of the cradle. You can see the mules and the driver on the bridge. And then in the lower photo, we're looking the other direction. The boat's going through the guard lock and continuing on into the canal. This is at the lower photo is at Waterloo Village. If you go there today, the scene pretty much looks the same. Locks there. The canal's still watered. There's the canal store, which is on the right. But if you look on the left, you see wide open fields. That's all thick woods today. And that kind of is why the canals were built, because of that wood depletion that I mentioned. Okay, so the canals mostly navigated across the river in that way. But what about when it was going across the Delaware River? It couldn't use that same method. You couldn't, Delaware was too big. So it used another method, and that was by cable. So this illustration shows going across the Delaware River from Easton to Phillipsburg. In the background, you see Easton, Pennsylvania. On the left is the outlet of the Lehigh Canal. And what the boats would do is they come out of Lehigh, they would attach themselves to the cable, and then the captain would point the boat downstream. So if you look at the tiller, he has the tiller hard to port, meaning to left, which would point the bow to the right, or starboard downstream. And then you see a scow there in the stern, which is helping keep that stern upstream so the bow is pointed downstream. So what it would be doing is using the current then to guide the boat across the river, and the cable to keep it from going away, so it keeps it in a straight line. And this is how it crossed the Delaware River in two places: Newark to Phillipsburg. Easton to Phillipsburg to get on the Morris Canal, and New Hope to Lambertville to get onto the DNR Canal. Now, if you were coming across Easton to Phillipsburg, you would go from the river through this entrance arch that you see in the upper left. And that is a surviving artifact from the Morris Canal. It's kind of the entrance to the canal. And it had a utilitarian purpose. The reason for this stone arch was, if you look closely, you can see grooves in the middle of the arch. And there was a gate that slid down there. And the whole point of it was keeping debris from the river from flowing into the canal. But if a boat was entering the Morris Canal from the Delaware River, it would come through here, and it would immediately go to the first plane on the western side, which is plane 11 west. So if you see the historic photo, you see the cradle there at the bottom of the inclined plane. This boat has just come down the plane. It's about to go out of the cradle and then through the arch and out to the Delaware River, where it'll be hooked to the cable to go back over to Easton. Now, that historic photo in the lower left, that had to have been taken before 1894, because the boat stopped running across the Delaware in 1894. Why was that? Well, the two reasons. Lehigh locket for the Lehigh Canal was damaged in 1894 because of a flood. But also at that point, the railroads had come into existence, so they're now able to transport coal across the river by rail. So if you look at the upper right-hand photo, you see the section of Phillipsburg. This was called Port Delaware because it was a port in the Morris Canal. And you see this basin, Port Delaware Basin. At the far end would be the head of the inclined plane. It took you down to the river. That little house on the left of the basin, that was the toll collector's house. You had to pay tolls on the Morris Canal. And the photos being taken from the summit of Mount Parnassus, and it's looking down. You can see Port Delaware, Delaware River, and Phillipsburg on your right, and then Easton on the far side of the river. So all those coal cars would then go through a cut in Mount Parnassus, and then on the other side of the mountain, you can see in the lower photo with the coal chutes. So that's where the coal was loaded from the trains into the canal boats. So there are all the canal boats waiting there. They would maneuver themselves under the uh, coal cars, and then they would use gravity to fill the coal into the holds of the boats. Now this, even though we're doing this lectures on the Morris Canal, I will show you the outlet at the DNR Canal in Lambertville. So down on the DNR, the boats would cross the Delaware from New Hope in Pennsylvania to Lambertville. At that point, it would go down the feeder to Trenton and onto the main canal. So the upper photo, you see the outlet lock there in Lambertville. A boat's about to go out into the Delaware River. And then right below it, you see a photo from today. This was the canal tour, and you could see the outlet lock is still in existence in Lambertville. So if you're down in Lambertville, just take the walk south of town, and you can find this outlet lock. That's where the boats went from the DNR feeder out into the Delaware River. And since the current was much stronger down at this section, it did need a wing dam. It needed to slow down the current a little bit to get the boats across. So there was a wing dam at Lambertville too. That also survived. So you can kind of walk out in that wing dam and see that. And that's right below the DNR outlet lock. Now, if the canal ran above a river, it didn't navigate across because of the topography. It used aqueducts, and aqueducts was basically like a water bridge, a bridge of the canal that went over another river. And the aqueduct seen here is the one at Lincoln Park, and it was the longest aqueduct. It was 275 feet long. Very impressive structure. And today it's gone. It's completely gone. If you go to Aqueduct Park, the only thing you'll see is a few stones on a bank that served as its abutment. But yeah, that was the Lincoln Park Aqueduct, and that took the boats from Lincoln Park in Morris County to Mountain View in Wayne County. So across the Pompton River, which was the county line. And then this was the biggest man-made structure on the Morris Canal, the Little Falls Aqueduct. And it was huge. You could see how big it was. And there it was being used recreationally. In the final days of the canal, the cargo boats were no longer running, but the canal was used, swimmers, boaters, and so on. And there in the middle of the aqueduct on the left, you see the couple canoeists and the swimmer in the water. And this structure was destroyed right after the canal abandonment in 1924. They blew it up with dynamite. So you see in the lower right, that's boom, they're blowing this aqueduct up, and it took several tries before they totally, completely destroyed. If you go to Little Falls Park today, or the Morris Canal Park in Little Falls today, there's a water line running across this area. So you can see where this aqueduct once existed. Now, the boats were, Morris Canal boats were designed strictly for cargo transportation, and they were really the only type of boats that ran the Morris Canal. The DNR Canal, they had all kinds of big boats. They had big schooners and steamers and tugs and so on. The Morris Canal basically was these flat bottoms, low slung cargo boats, and they were 91 feet long. They were 10.5 feet wide. They were in two hinge sections. And the reason for the hinges is that the boat went over the inclined plane. It had to be able to bend. So both the cradle and boats were hinged, as you see in the lower right, going over the plain. And they were mostly all cargo hold. You can see it was two sections of cargo hold, just a small 10 by 10 cabin in the back, and where the captain and his family slept. And they were just very simple boats. And then in the middle of the boat, they had the hinges, and that was where you had the most dock space, and the mule feed boxes. And the mule feed, that was like your fuel. You always had to have mule feed. You had to keep your mules fed to keep them going. And this is a really good photo. It shows a Morris Canal boat in the lock. First of all, you can see what a tight fit it was. Boats were 90 feet by 10.5 feet. The locks were 95 feet by 11 feet. So you had 3-inch clearance on each side. That's it. And it was very tight. Here you see the stern. You see this small cabin. Every Morris Canal boat had a number. This one is 769. That's so you can keep track of tolls, and which boats pay tolls, how much cargo they were transporting, things like that. You can see the steering mechanism, the tiller and the rudder. There's a rope attached to the rudder, and that's to lower it and raise it depending on how high and low and the boat was in the water. This is a light or empty boat, so it's very high in the water. You can see the couple windows in the stern, that's for the cabin. And then you see that barrel to the right of the cabin. That was for drinking water. The canalers used the canal water for washing, but they couldn't drink it, so they had to have barrels of spring water to consume. And to navigate a boat, you took minimum of 2 people. The captain steer it. People say, why didn't the boat go into the bank if you just had 2 mules on one side? And that was because, the captain was steering it, keep it out in the middle of the canal. And then a mule driver, who would just his job was to keep the mules walking along the towpath. And you can see the mule driver over the left. These were often family affairs where the husband or the wife would steer the boat and the kids would drive the mule. And the mule tender was usually a young man if he was hired. He could be as young as 10 or 12 years old, and he would walk 20 miles a day. The boat canal was 102 miles long. It took 5 days to get across, so it's 20 miles a day, and that was 6 days a week. So here we see a young mule driver with the mules, and he's about to pull the boat out of a lock. And if the captain had a family, it could be a son who served as a mule driver, or it could be a woman. Now, these 2 women we see here were both daughters of canal boat captains, and they both served as mule drivers. Now, we know about their story because back in the 1970s, James Lee Sr. Conducted a number of interviews with people who used to live and work on the canal. They did so as children. They were now in their 80s or 90s. And he created this great firsthand account of what life was like on the Morris Canal. And he published this in a book, and the book was called Tales of Boatmen Told. And it's a great resource. So he interviewed these 2 women separately. And if we look at the interview with Mrs. Van Horn, she says, canalists helped one another. They were good kind. They were poor people that had the boats, but they were good to each other. Then in a separate interview with Mrs. Mann, who was the daughter of Captain Peter Lindstrom, she talked about when they had a mule die along the way, and she said, we borrowed off of Mr. Jim Campbell, who was Mrs. Van Horn's father. So unbeknownst to these 2 women, Mrs. Mann was talking about how Mrs. Van Horn's father lent them a mule. So that kind of was the extended family that existed amongst the canalers and how they all helped each other out. Also, interestingly, there were Morris Canal boat captain descendants who were involved with the Morris Canal Greenway effort today. So these 2 gentlemen on the bottom are both great grandsons of the Morris Canal boat captains. On the left, you have Jim Lee III. He's the grandson of the man who wrote the book, Tales of Boatmen Told. And on the right is Bob Swint. And it's interesting. I introduced these gentlemen a couple of years ago. They're both from Warren County. And as Jim met Bob, he said, I understand your family lent my family a mule at one time. So these stories about continue on to the descendants. But both these guys are involved in the Morris Canal Greenway. Jim is involved throughout Morris County, and Bob is he and his family are restoring the home where his grandfather James Campbell lived in Washington Borough. So very interesting. The people's story is very interesting too. So here we just have a really good photo. This shows what life was like on a canal boat. The canalers lived on these boats 9 months out of the year. Any time of the year when the canal was not frozen over, the boats would be running. Could be in the heat of the summer, it could be, when there's snow on the ground. And we see here the captain's at the tiller and his wife is there at the hinges where you had the most deck space. And she's cooking something up on an open stove. She's got some laundry hanging out to dry. She's got a pot of water used for cooking or washing. And, this was just their life on a boat. If the weather was nice, they did most things on deck because the cabin would be very small and stuffy, and you wouldn't want to spend a lot of time down there unless you had to. So the captain typically rented their boat from the Morris Canal Banking Company. They were responsible for the upkeep of the boat. So here we see their captain and his driver using the cradle of an inclined plane as a dry dock to fix a hole in the hull. Because the boats leaked a lot, you were constantly patching them up. But since the Morris Canal had inclined planes, if you could ask the plane tender to stop the cradle, if another boat's not waiting, that would be a good opportunity for you to fix a leak, as you see they're doing here. And this is also a good time to feed the mules their lunch, as you see. The mules are eating there. Now, the captain would typically rent his boat, but he had to provide the mules. So if you wanted to be a canal boat captain, you had to buy a team of mules. It cost you about $150, and that was an exorbitant amount of money back then. So you have to save up to buy your mule team, and you took very good care of them because they were your bread and butter. You kept them fed and brushed and watered and so on. And the captain was judged by how well he kept his mules. So here we see a picture of a very proud canal boat captain with his team of mules. And if you think of canal boat captains as kind of like independent truckers, this was their semi. This is what they, kept in good condition because that's how they made their money. Now, the mules, a lot of people asked, did the mules go on the boats? No, there were no rooms for them. There were many stables up and down the canal provided by the Morris Canal Banking Company, and that's where the mules stayed for the night. So if you were a mule driver, you had a very long day because you had to get up at the crack of dawn to get the mules up and fed and watered and get the harness on. And then at the end of the day, you had to do the opposite and get them into the stables at night. So the Morris Canal boats had very little storage, had no refrigeration. So there were a number of canal stores all up and down the canal. And they were like the ones you see here, right on the banks of the canal. And this allowed the canal boat captains to drive right up and get goods loaded right in the boat. So just kind of like a drive-through today. And you see these two canal stores. These are the one in the upper left is at Waterloo Village, and a boat's about to go by the canal store. This is now a museum. If you come to Waterloo, you could see this store, or Canal Day this year is June 21st. Good time to come. And the one in the lower right, this is the Perry store in Port Murray, and it exists architecturally intact. It's not a museum, it's actually a woodworking shop. So it's one of the few canal stores that still exists as an operating business. And then there's another very good canal store. This is the King's Store in Ledgewood. It's the second canal store. It's a museum. It's operated by the Rockaway Historic Trust. And you can see how they done up the inside really well. It was a general store. They sold all types of goods. And it was actually a good place to hang out. They'd have a potbelly stove, and this is where the captains would gather and smoke their pipes and drink their coffee and catch up on gossip. And this store was located right across the street from a canal basin that was at the foot of two inclined planes. There would probably be a lot of boats backed up there. So it was really smart place to build a store. And if you could see the residence behind the store, which is also totally preserved, the Kings did very well. They had a very nice house, and they did very well with this canal store. All right, so what killed off the canal? Well, it's pretty easy answer. The railroad did. It took a canal boat 5 days to get across the state. It took a train only 5 hours, and a train could pull, one locomotive could pull about 10 canal boats worth of cargo. So it was a foregone conclusion from pretty much the 1860s on that the railroad would eventually take over the canal business. But it wasn't immediate. It wasn't one day they switched over. It was a gradual progression from the 1860s into the turn of the 20th century, where the railroad slowly took over the canal business. Now, what kept the Morris Canal Banking Company going the last few decades was an agreement in 1872 with the Lehigh Valley Railroad, which leased out all of the Morris Canal property. Now, their main goal was to get this piece of property that you see in the upper right. And if you don't recognize that, that today is Liberty State Park. But back then, it was a very, very desirable piece of property because it was right across the Hudson from Lower Manhattan, and you could see all the rail lines coming in. You could see all the piers. The Morris Canal Bank Company once owned all that land, and that basin there, or that inlet you see, which still exists, that was and is still called Morris Canal Basin because it was owned. Now today, that's all Liberty State Park, beautiful park. The one thing that's really beautifully restored is the train depot that's there, and that's where all the immigrants came from Ellis Island through that depot, and then they would get on the trains to wherever their destination was. In the lower left, this was pretty much after the cargo boats were no longer transporting, so the canal was used for other purposes. Here, the trains were bringing vacationers into the station at Lake Hopatcong, and then these steam launches were taking them up through the canal, up through the feeder into Lake Hopatcong, and delivering them to resorts around the lake. So the canal, in its latter days, started having other purposes than cargo transportation. Also, it was used recreationally. A lot of swimmers, canoers, things like that. So our story started with a gentleman named George McCullough, and it ends with another gentleman named Hudson Maxim. And Hudson Maxim was very influential in having the canal abandoned. And the reason was he was a very wealthy landowner. He, just like George McCullough, he's very wealthy, and he owned lots and lots of land on the west side of Lake Hopatcong. A lot of things named Maxim and Hopatcong Borough in the area. And there was a 10-15 year period after the cargo traffic dried up where they weren't sure what they were going to do with this canal. And one of the ideas was to use it as a water source. Now, that's very interesting because the reason that the DNR Canal still exists is because it is used as a water source today. But Hudson Maxim had a great fear of that because he thought, well, if they're constantly drawing water off the canal, and the canal is getting its water from Lake Hopatcong, that's going to really deplete the level of the lake, and therefore, would also devalue his, land holdings. So he really led the abandonment effort and wrote lots of reports, attended a lot of meetings, said, we have to abandon this canal. So the perception of Hudson Maxim is very interesting. If you're a Lake Hopatcong person, he's kind of a hero. He's the guy who saved our beautiful lake. And, if it wasn't for him, the lake would have been depleted. If you're a Morris Canal enthusiast, he's the bad guy in the story. He's the one who destroyed this beautiful canal, boo hiss Hudson Maxim. But what really occurred in that 100 years between the beginning and end of the canal is our relationship with water changed drastically. In the early part of the 19th century, water was used strictly for industry. It was used to power forges, to power mills. It was used for transportation. People really didn't recreate in the water. By the turn of the 20th century, everything was changed. We had better transportation like trains. We had other better sources of power. But we had fallen in love with water recreation. The Jersey Shore was, booming, and Lake Hopatcong was the biggest freshwater resort in New Jersey. So really, it was the change in our relationship with how we used water that really was a factor here. But Hudson Maxim got his way, and in 1924, the canal was officially abandoned. So here we are 100 years later, and we have this effort called the Morris Canal Greenway, and that's a collaborative effort amongst many entities, state, municipalities, counties, organizations like the Canal Society, to restore and preserve sections of the canal and to educate people on a canal, just such as I'm doing here tonight. And there are a number of great Morris Canal Greenway sites across the state. The photo here is at Forest Park in Wharton. This is the lock where we saw the photo of the boat going through with the two little girls. It's the only completely restored lock on the Morris Canal Greenway, one of the longest watered section of canals. Very few watered section, but there are a number of great sites that I would invite you to explore across the Morris Canal Greenway. If you're interested, go to our website, canalsocietyNJ.org, and there's numerous trail brochures for where you can go to visit these sites. And this is work in progress. If you're interested, and I'll put my contact information up here, on May 28th, the New Jersey Transportation Authority is hosting a Morris Canal Working Group. They do it twice a year, and we report on all the projects, Morris Canal Greenway projects going on across the state. Joe McKasick, who's the president, myself, do that. If you're interested in attending that meeting, it's a virtual meeting, so you don't have to go anywhere. Send me an email, and I will send you a link to that. But it's interesting. There's a lot of great, exciting projects, and I would encourage you to attend. So with that, that brings my presentation to a close, and I will open up for any questions you may have.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Yes, we've had a few good questions come in. By the way, everyone, my name's Cindy Kunis. I'm with Delaware River Greenway Partnership, and wanted to thank you all for joining us. The first question is, are there any inclined planes that still exist?
There are I'll call them remnants of planes. In other words, planes where the plane is still there, the sleeper stones is still there, which are the stones where the rails were attached, and you could see the turbine. Now, the best one to go to, and one we just had a big opening for a couple weeks ago, is in Morris Canal Park in Ledgewood. We just had a lot of refurbishing done, and we just installed a bunch of interpretive signage. So you could do a self-guided tour, you can read the signs, and you could see the chamber where the large turbine is. Now the chamber is empty, but if you take a short ride up to Hopatcong State Park, you could see that large turbine that was in the photo. So that's a very good one to visit. The only plane that has the turbine intact in the chamber is Plane 9 West in Port Warren in Stewartsville. They used to run tours once a month, but 2 years ago there was a big rainstorm and the bridge was washed out. So it's not easy to get to. But once they repair the bridge, they'll start the tours. And that's really the best one because you can go in through the tail race tunnel and see the turbine. So yeah, there are a number of different plane sites where you'll see different degrees of remnants, but not a complete working inclined plane.
Great. If the boats were hinged so they could bend, how did they avoid taking on water at the seam?
Well, you had two separate, distinct and independent hull sections that were completely enclosed, and they were hinged together with sockets and chain. So think of it as being really two separate boats that were attached together, so they wouldn't take on water, because each section had hull, sections of hull, or hull and transom, we'll say, all around it. So the forward section would have the bow, and then the stern section would have the rudder and tiller. If you're really interested in boats, there's a park in Warren County. It's called Dreadlock Park. It's on Route 57 in Stewartsville, and they have an actual full-size replica Morris Canal boat. And the park's open. It's outside, so it's open sunrise to sunset any day. You can stop there and go on this boat and walk around the deck and see it, and that gives you a really, really good idea of what the boat looked like, and how it was, and what life was like on it. So I'd encourage anyone to do that. Also, on June 21st, we're going to have a Canal Day Festival at Waterloo Village. We have an exhibit there on Morris Canal boats, and we actually have the remnants of an actual Morris Canal boat. We have the the bow section of the boat there on display, but we also have a big exhibit that talks all about the boats and their design and so on.
It's going to be interesting to visit.
Yes.
So did they use the same mules all along, or did they change mules at different locations?
No, if you were a canal boat captain, they were your mules, and they followed you everywhere. So, the analogy I used for a canal boat captain is, think of an independent trucker. You own your semi, your rig, and then you transport various cargoes based on whatever you're contracted to do. So the canal boat captains, they would rent the canal boat, but the mules were basically their engine and their their capital. That was what you had to buy to be a canal boat captain, and they followed you one side of the state to the other, back and forth. Now, a lot of people will say, well, this was very cruel, making these mules pull these heavy boats. It was actually very easy. Once you get a boat going, it's very, very easy to keep it going. The mules back then, who really had it hard, were mules that worked on a farm, because they would be pulling the plow through thick dirt. They would be hitting rocks, hitting roots. Those were the mules that really had hard work. Canal boat mules, it was actually pretty easy. And if you visit Moore Park, not Forest Park, Moore Park in Easton, and the National Canal Museum, they actually have a team of mules down there. Their names are George and Hank, and they actually give mule-drawn canal boat rides. And you can see how easy the mules are pulling this boat without really any effort at all.
Very true. For how long during the year was the canal typically out of service on account of the ice?
Typically, say about 3 months. The boats would run until it iced up, and that's what would stop it. They didn't stop because the weather got cold, because we actually have photos of canal boats running when there was snow on the ground. Now, a lot of people ask, okay, well, how did they make money off the canal during the winter? Well, many places along the canal, there were large basins. And the basins where they would stop overnight and over Sundays, and where they would turn and do repair on the boats. And these basins were great locations for ice cutting. So back in the 19th century, there was no refrigeration, there was no electricity. Everyone had an ice box, and that's how you kept your perishables fresh. So ice cutting was a big business. So during the winter, we have lots of photos of people cutting ice by hand in various basins up and down the canal. So figure roughly, and it depended on how the weather was each year, but figure basically 9 months the boats were running, and 3 months they weren't.
Right. How far along did the canal crew take a boat? The whole 102 miles, or did they crew pass the boat along to the next crew?
No, basically it was like an independent trucker. It was your boat, your business. You would just be running your boat sunrise to sunset 6 days a week. And it was a very hard life. People today tend to romanticize it, say, oh, what an idyllic life it would be. It wasn't at all. You were living on these boats, very uncomfortable, no plumbing, no amenities. You were sleeping on very uncomfortable bunks. The cabins would get very hot. And it was a tough life. And think about it. In the summer, sunrise is like 5 in the morning, sunset might be 8 or 9 at night. So, very, very long days. And what would stop a canal boat captain for the night was not necessarily darkness. They could run in the dark. They could put a lantern or what was called a hawker on the bow of their boat. What would stop you is if you came to a lock or an inclined plane that was closed. So there were numerous places along the canal that were called levels, and they were stretches of canal where there were no changes in elevation. Strategic canal boat captains would try to plan their trip so they'd hit one of those levels right before sunset, and that way you could get a number of miles in that day before you had to stop for the night. These canal boats ran like 2-3 miles an hour. So even if you got, 5 additional miles in before nightfall, that was a big deal. So yeah, that's you. Yeah, you just that was your life being canal boat captain. And during those 3 months when you weren't running, usually you had some other job you would do, work in a factory or something like that.
Yeah, that sounds rough. Were there only one canal boat on the canal at a time? If not, where did they pull over to let another one by?
Okay, so this is how that worked. The canal was about 40 feet wide. The canal boats were 10 and a half feet wide. So obviously there was plenty of room for canal boats to pass each other. Typically, you would have typically the heaviest cargo would be moving east. So you would have the laden boats that were very low in the water running east, and the lighter boats would run, which would be higher in the water, running west. So the heavier boat would move to the burn side of the towpath, meaning the side opposite the towpath, and it would drop its tow rope down into the water. The light boat, the high boat, which would only draw like a foot of water at the most, would then glide over that tow rope. And so that's how they would pass each other if they were going in the opposite directions. It was also how a faster, lighter boat would overtake a heavier one. So yes, they did have to coordinate to pass each other, so they had kind of rules like if you're familiar with Coast Guard rules today, and what powered boats and sailboats do in crossing and passing situation. The canal boats on the Morris Canal kind of had their rules of what they had to follow in accounting other boats.
Great. How much traffic or how many boats traveled the canal daily?
At the peak in the 1860s, you would have hundreds of boats a day. During the waning years, most of the photographs you see were taken within the first 10 years of the 20th century, usually most of them around 1904 and 1905. That was when he had very, very few boats. It would be a rare occurrence for a boat to come through. And that's why they were photographed, because it was a big deal then. Like, wow, canal boats going, was a remnant of the past. So, it varied from hundreds a day to, maybe just a dozen a day that would pass a, particular spot. But yeah, that's what we don't have is we don't have the photos from the canal's heyday where you see, all these boats backed up at locks and planes and so on. Because canals were very prevalent back then. People wouldn't think they were interesting to film. And, back then cameras were big and bulky. You'd have to carry it out to the site. Then you had to develop the photo right away. So, most of the photos were from the very later years of the canal.
About how many mules were used for each boat?
A team of 2 mules. Each captain had a mule team, 2 mules, and cost was about $150. You would have a lead mule, which was usually the smarter and more, aggressive than two, and that would be the one in front, and then the other one would pretty much follow. But yeah, it was typically a team of 2 mules. Mules, by the way, are a cross between a male donkey, which is a jack, and a female horse, which was a mare. And they were very smart creatures. You may have heard the expression stubborn as a mule. Stubbornness is actually intelligence. They were smart enough not to do what they considered to be dangerous. They also shied away from water, and that kind of seems strange. Why would you have mules walking around along a waterway all day if they didn't like water? But that kept them from jumping in when it got really hot. A horse will jump in the water, a mule won't. So that's why mules were used. They were the best beasts. And I use the analogy: horses are like sports cars. They're sleek and beautiful and fast, but they have a lot of health problems. Mules were slower. They were more sturdy. They weren't as good looking as horses, but they were much more reliable. So they were like, an old pickup truck that, it's not fast, it's not pretty, but it gets the job done.
Great explanation right there. So great presentation. Any canal boats still existing? I think you already kind of touched on this.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting story. We found a canal boat in the most odd place that we'd ever think to find it. If you're familiar with the Highlands, that's down in the south part of the Raritan Bay, right by Sandy Hook. And it was back 2015. They were raising a house up because of Hurricane Sandy remediation, and it was a very odd house. It was very long and it still exists, very narrow. And they raised it up, and they actually found a canal boat underneath it. And it was actually half a canal boat. It was the front half of a Morris Canal boat. So we had a archaeologists look at it and confirm that it was a Morris Canal boat, and that was one that we got donated to the Canal Society, and we brought it up to Waterloo Village and had it on display. So everyone asks the question: how did the canal boat get under a house nowhere near the Morris Canal? Well, the prevailing theory is after the abandonment of the canal, they used these canal boats for other purposes. So they floated one down to the Raritan Bay via the Arthur Kill, and it was used for clamming on the Raritan Bay. It was docked in the Highlands. Hurricane in the 1930s totally redistributed the land and landlocked the boat. And then instead of trying to dredge it out, they actually built a house on it. And if you come to Waterloo, and we have a whole panel that shows the whole story and how we got it out and trucked it up to Waterloo and everything. But the house is the oddest house you ever see. It's like a railroad car, very, very long and very narrow. But that was because they built it on top of the canal boat, so it has the same dimensions of the canal boat. So yeah, that's the only one that exists that you can look at. There are other ones we hear that are buried in various waterways across the state. Someone a couple of weeks ago was telling me, yeah, there's one way at the bottom of Lake Opakon, and we should, have this expedition to go under 200 feet and, salvage it and so on. But, that's not going to happen. But yes, we do have one that people can come and see and touch, and it's there at Waterloo Village.
Wow, that's a cool story.
Yeah.
Was there any bituminous coal carried, or was it all anthracite?
Oh, it was all types of coal. The anthracite coal was the main reason for building the canal, but the boats carried all kinds of cargo, from coal to iron ore to lime to farm goods, beer, manure. People always ask, what did they travel east to west? And I said, well, in the cities there are lots of horses, So there were lots of manure, and the farmers in the West needed that manure. So a really big east to west cargo was manure, sawdust, wood. We have a toll sheet that has probably 30 different types of cargo, and it has like 10 different types of coals. So basically any type of cargo that was used back then was transported by canal boat.
Great. Can you explain a Jersey pear?
Okay, Jersey pair. Jersey pair of mules is a mule where you have one white colored and one dark colored mule. So typically, canal boat captains would match their colors up. You have two dark ones, two white ones, but sometimes you had a Jersey pair. Now, people always ask, where does the name come from? It has nothing to do with the state of New Jersey. It actually has to do with the island of Jersey in England. And that island produced a type of cow called a Jersey cow, and a Jersey cow has both black and white coloring on it. So that's how the Jersey pair got its name. One dark colored mule, one light colored mule. So yeah, that's called a Jersey pair.
That was a great question because I didn't see that one coming.
Yeah.
Did the canal boat families remain on the boats during the 3 months that navigation stopped due to ice?
No, they would typically have a home that they would go to. Not all the canal boats were family affairs. A lot of times the wife would stay home with the kids, and the father would be out on the canal either with an older son, or he might hire a young man as a mule driver. So but they would typically have their own home outside the canal boat. So what they would do with the boats in the winter is either on the east side or the west side of the canal, where there are basins with salt water in them. That's where they would store it for the winter. So the ice wouldn't freeze up around them and destroy the boats. And then they would hole up in their homes, and usually took some other type of employment during that time.
Okay, yeah, I think you touched on this. What was the typical cargo on a westbound boat?
Manure. It could be anything, lumber. It could be kegs of beer. Basically, canal boat captains transported anything that someone was to pay him money. We have photos of a canal boat carrying a carriage, like horse and carriage, that type of carriage. You could see it in the cargo hold. Someone said, "Hey, can you transport this carriage from one town?" Yeah, pay me some money, I'll transport anything. We have a picture of a canal boat captain carrying a couple of small boats on a haul. So, it could be anything. Usually the larger, heavier cargo like coal and iron ore was transported west to east, where east to west, was probably a lighter cargo, which is why the boats were, higher on the water.
Okay, and one last question. What was a typical day on the boat? Did children live on board, cooking, sleeping, recreation, at a turning basin?
So I'm sorry, what was the typical what?
Day on the boat.
Oh,
Did the
day on the boat.
children
So
live on board?
yeah, day on the boat would be sunrise to sunset, which, as I said, would be a very long day. If you had very young children, toddlers, you would tie them to the boat. We have photos of that. You would tie them because you didn't want them to fall in and drown. Older children would probably have chores to do. They would take turns driving the mules, cleaning, making repairs, whatever. Uh, they might have, if they were lucky, they might have a few toys to play with, but these were very poor people. There weren't a lot of luxuries. And then at sunset, you would come to a basin and you would stop for the night. One of the kids would put the mules in the stable, unharness them, feed them, water them, get them in the stables for the night. You would cook your meal on a boat, and boats would usually raft up together. We have photos of them rafting up together, and they were socializing, a lot of music. They would play music, they might dance and tell stories. and jokes and so on and so forth. And then the only day off was Sunday. So Sunday you would probably find a basin close to a bigger town, where there would be stores to get supplies. There'd be a blacksmith shop if you needed to reshoe one of your mules, and if you were a churchgoer, a church nearby to go to. So Dover is a good example. Dover had a really big basin in the middle of it. It was the halfway point across the canal, and Dover is a pretty big town. So, would have had all those things that you needed to stop overnight or spend a Sunday or whatever. So yeah, that was typical day, and it was a hard life, and you're doing that 6 days a week.
Wow, yeah, that's a lot. No wonder why they tied their boats up together and played some music and
Yeah, get a little bit of
took a little enjoyment,
downtime.
a
Yeah.
little downtime. All right, I did have two more questions come in. Would you recommend resources to learn more?
Go to our website. We do have real basic on both the Morris Canal and the DNR Canal. There are a number of great books out there. I mentioned Tales of Boatmen Told. Those are the interviews with the people who lived and worked on a boat. Another one is Morris Canal, The Age of Ingenuity by Kevin D. Wright, which is an excellent book. If you really want the Bible of the Morris Canal, that's 100 Years, 100 Miles by Barbara Colodis. I mean, that's my primary source. That's the source that really has everything on the Morris, but it's, very, very deep read, very, very detailed on the Morris Canal. And then there's a book that was actually, I have one right here. Hold it up. Disappearing Act. This is a book that was just recently published, and it's specifically about the abandonment, which was 100 years ago, and what happened when they abandoned the canal. What did they do? How did they, what did they do with all the bridges and locks and inclined planes and so on? So that's an excellent book too, and gives you lots of insight.
Great. Is there any evidence of canal boats conveying self-emaciated, formerly enslaved people as part of the Underground Railroad?
Okay, that's a good question, and that is a question that is under great debate, and it's one that I've kind of flipped back and forth on. What I can tell you without any uncertainty is that there are many places along the Morris Canal that we stops on the Underground Railroad. In fact, the one I'm most familiar with is in Boonton Township, Griffin Park. You can go there. There's a nice little pocket park. Look over to your right. There's this small apartment building. That was called the Powerville Inn, and it was definitely a stop in the Underground Railroad, owned by an abolitionist. And I used to say that itself is circumstantial evidence that slaves were probably transported by canal boat, because canal boats were big. There are a lot of hiding places in the hold to hide a slave. But the argument against it being used, first of all, the canal, people say, well, the canal ran east and west, and runaway slaves are heading north. But okay, that's not necessarily a showstopper, because the canal actually went all kinds of different directions. But really, what kind of got me to flip against it is, if you're a runaway slave, you're basically a fugitive. Think of a fugitive today with a bounty hunter chasing you, and you're trying to get to a safe haven. Safe haven would probably be like Canada. You would probably want to be traveling as quickly as possible. Canal boats only travel at 2-3 miles an hour. So, based on that, that doesn't really support very well that the canal boats were used. In fact, you could walk at a strong pace faster than you could ride on a canal boat. So we've had email strings with all kinds of different historical societies, African American Historical Society, and there's opinions both ways. But what we haven't found yet is any definitive evidence where, even a third-hand account where someone says, yes, I remember my great grandfather telling me how they transported slaves on his canal boat. So it is kind of an unanswered question. We don't know for sure. It could be possible, but at this point, we don't have any solid evidence that runaway slaves are transported on Morris Canal boat. If we do find that evidence, then we will definitely share it. We'll write up our newsletter article and so on. But yeah, at this point, it's kind of an unanswered question.
No, that makes perfect sense. And yeah, it would be exciting to find something, but it just doesn't
Oh yeah,
quite sound
very much.
terribly likely that new evidence will turn out. But hey, history is always changing.
Yeah, you always find new things, and that's true.
So thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you for your interesting questions. And keep an eye on our calendar for our next lecture. We'll be announcing it soon. And have a wonderful night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.